this off now. We have a few people on, and anybody who joins after this can surely listen to the recording. So welcome to this day's episode of Nash Talks. It's a series we created to help our network in gaining access to short talks with real good takeaways to help us all through these challenging times. So today, we're delighted to have Áine Maher speaking to us. Áine is a diversity and inclusion consultant working with various organisations, as well as engaging in freelance bespoke work. So having completed her Masters in King's College London in the psychology and neuroscience of mental health, Áine chose to specialise in emotional inclusion while using her experience in neuroscience to enhance her clientele's learning experience. So prior to becoming a consultant, she was with the people operations team of Facebook in Dublin. So while focusing on the employee experience in her HR specialist role, Áine got involved with mental health and neurodiversity as two of the group's core pillars. So her passion is clearly in destigmatizing mental health and neurodivergence. And so Áine, I'll hand over to you, and of course we'll allow for some questions at the end, and if we don't, you can always send them through afterwards. So I'll leave it over to you.
Thanks so much, Susan, and welcome everybody. So today, before I even move on from our beginning slide, I want to take a moment to set mental health as a concept. So we're all on the same page, as the term is used in lots of different ways colloquially. So your mental health, it's not like your cholesterol, for example. It's not that you might have bad mental health or good mental health. It's actually much more like your physical health. We all have it. There's parts we can control, like making healthy life choices, and aspects that we can't control, like when we're faced with certain illnesses. The goal of my work is to reduce stigma around mental health and have it viewed in society as it should, not as something that we should be ashamed of if we aren't feeling the best, but the recognition that it's just biology and chemistry that gets affected by different things and changes over time. So for today's session, we're going to have a quick look at our agenda. So we're going to start off by having a really, really good look at ourselves, because the simple fact is that we cannot give from an empty cup. So before we even start looking at others, we really have to make sure that we're looking after ourselves and engaging in self-care where we can. We're also then going to look at allyship, so where we can step in for others when we're in the position to do so, and some resources that we can take up on board for both ourselves and for the organisations in which we're a part of or in which we support. And then, of course, as Susan mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end as well. Now, before I get started, I do want to do just a very quick disclaimer, who I am and who I'm not. So I am not a neuroscientist. I have qualifications in neuroscience, as Susan mentioned, but I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm also not a nutritionist, and I'm not a clinical psychologist or a counsellor. I'm a facilitator of learning. And as that facilitator, I use my understanding of neuroscience to translate it into something that's usable in the everyday, simply because I found it empowering myself. I've studied psychology and mental health for 10 years now, and I can say definitively that my mental health is the best that it's ever been. Rocky at times, like us all, and tested at the moment for sure, but I am definitely better equipped by following the science. So my goal is to give people a deeper understanding of their brains that will empower you all to search for things that work for you. I hope today's learning will encourage you to fill up your own mental toolbox and therefore encourage others to do the same. So let's dive straight into the neuroscience. This is a neuron. They come in lots of different shapes and sizes all over our brain, but they all follow the same basic idea, that at one end we have the cell body and dendrites, and that's where all the information comes into a neuron. It then travels down this long channel that we see called an axon and comes out the other side. Now, when we talk about neural pathways, it's a pretty common term that's thrown around, but what is it actually? What a neural pathway is, it's the chain of neurons speaking to one another. So all of these neurons in a line sending information. Think of a neural pathway almost like binary code. There's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all encoded in there. And the neural pathways that we use most are going to be the ones that are strongest. So that's essentially why practice makes perfect. Now, the reason why practice makes perfect is these little yellow nodes that we see along the axon. So that's called myelin. Now, think about myelin the way you think about the muscle on your arm, and think about a thought, a feeling, or a behavior like a bicep curl. So every time a piece of information is sent through that neural pathway, the neuron fires. It's almost like it's doing a little bicep curl, and the myelin actually gets stronger. So physically, those yellow pieces that you see on the screen, they get bigger the more that a neuron is used. Now, and equally, the opposite is true. So when we think about the fact that neurons are getting stronger the more they're used, also when we think about habits that we try and move away from, those neural pathways eventually start to get weaker. Now, the important thing to remember is that as we move our routines, which we're going to dive into deeply today, and while we change our habits, there is this transition period that we really have to effortfully choose which neural pathways we're given a workout, which habits we really want to instill in our brain's physiology. Once it's in there, it's going to become the default, and it's going to be like a switch over where we're going to have a more optimal way of functioning anyway. So our common thoughts, our common feelings and actions, they're going to dictate which are the strongest neural pathways. And before we move on any further, I do want to give a little shout out to some other cells in the brain that you could consider kind of the backstage crew that most people don't even really know exist. So these three little guys, the oligodendrocytes, we don't have to remember the names, but all you have to remember is that he helps to keep the myelin nice and firm around the axon. So they help, they're like the personal trainers. They're helping us build those muscles. The microglia, so these little green guys, they're kind of like the bouncers. So our brain doesn't have an immune system. Instead, the microglia come in and figure out what the issue is. They actually swell up and then decrease again once the threat has left. And then we have these big star-like figures, which are called astrocytes. And they're pretty much the project managers. So they're negotiating the transition between the blood and the brain. And then they're also cleaning up that extracellular space. So the reason why I wanted to show you these guys is to give you a really good idea of everything that's going on in your brain. And the fact is that today we're going to talk about how we can support both neurons and our glial cells. So that's what these guys are called. Glial means glue. So they're holding the whole thing together. And we can help all of these cells to function optimally the ways that we eat, sleep, work, and repeat. So let's have a look at how we can really instill this in our everyday. So we're all very aware of the fact that we need to eat. But why is it so important for our brain in particular? Well, our brain doesn't store any fat, yet it uses up about 20% of the sugar that we have in our body every day. So considering it's quite a small piece, that's a lot of energy to be taken. So what's really important for our brain is that we're giving it the right kind of nutrients to allow these cells to function optimally. Now, there's a whole wealth of literature around the different things that you can do to help your brain health from a nutritional standpoint. But there's kind of three main things that would be most important. So we have good fats, vitamin B, and antioxidants. Good fats are things like omega-3 or from nuts. And why that's important is for two major reasons. So one is that it helps our personal trainers, those oligodendrocytes, or ollies we'll call them. So that helps the myelin actually grow on our neurons, and it helps us to ensure that the neural pathways we want to be getting stronger have the fuel to do so. The other side of it is that oils actually help our brain clear out plaques that in later life could potentially lead to something like Alzheimer's. When we talk about vitamin B, that's all the things that come through in our nice leafy greens. And the main thing to remember about those is that they really help with cell structure. So really trying to keep those cells nice and strong. And then finally, antioxidants, so things like blueberries, for example, that tries to keep the oxidation levels down in our brain. All you need to know, it gets very complicated, but all you need to know is that the lower oxidation levels we have in our brains, the less susceptible we are to stress. The second thing we want to look at then is sleep. So sleep is like cleanup time for our brain. And we've talked about the vast amount of cells that are already in our brains. So we've got trillions and trillions. So how do we even manage to clear out some of that waste? Our brain doesn't have lymph nodes the way the rest of our body does. So what our brain does is something very, very cool. What you can see in the image here is the blood vessel circuitry for your brain. And what the brain does while we're asleep is it flushes cerebral fluid down the edges of these blood vessels. So it's like a deep clean and a flush out to try and get any kind of waste material out of our brains. So let's think about the flip side of that. When you don't have a good night of sleep and you've got that really difficult brain fog and your brain is just not working the way that you need it to, it's most likely because your brain hasn't had enough of a chance to try and flush out all of those, all of the waste materials that you would have accumulated from the day before. So when we think about sleep, again, there's kind of three big things that affect the quality of our sleep and help us to get sleep. So first off, blue light, using our phones. What happens with blue light is that it actually stops melatonin creation at the back of our brains. And what that means, melatonin is the hormone that makes us feel sleepy. So if we're looking at a blue screen, it's essentially cutting that off. Routine is so important, and it can be the tiniest routine going to sleep. So mine, for example, taking off my makeup, brushing my teeth, 10 minutes of reading, it gets your brain ready for sleep mode. And then finally, as we know, caffeine is a stimulant. So we want to try and stay away from that coming up towards bedtime. The third pillar, work. And it's a whole new world of work that we're looking at the moment. We're not really working from home, we're kind of living at work. And that can be really, really difficult because something that we had before was this segregation, the segregation between being a mom, for example, and being a board member. Now it's all kind of happening at once. And that's very difficult because what happens with our brains is this thing called task shift. So if I'm sitting here and I'm working away on a project, and let's say my 2-year-old comes running in because I don't have a minder at the moment because of the pandemic, or we go back into lockdown or something along those lines. It will take my brain, no matter how long it takes to deal with the toddler, it will take my brain about 9 minutes once I get to sit back down to get back to where I was. And thinking about how our brain uses energy, that's just not an efficient way of getting there. And finally, then we've lost a lot of our routines. So things that we did not even realize were upkeeping our mental health on the daily. Things like that segregation, that little bit of a thought time during our commute, a bit of social interaction outside of project work with our colleagues. All that kind of stuff is gone. And we have to make it really, really purposeful now to try and get back into new routines that are going to serve our mental health on an ongoing basis. Finally, let's talk about repeat as our fourth pillar. The power of routine cannot be underestimated, especially when it comes to our brains. Our brains love to take shortcuts. They love to put things into nice little boxes and to try and take advantage of this. What we should try and do is to create small routines. Now, I'm not talking plan the day from start to finish, because we all know different things come into effect and we're not able to maybe maintain that routine. We start to feel like a failure, and then you don't want to even try again in case you fail again. But the fact of the matter is that routines actually really conserve energy, but not when we think about them in that kind of all or nothing sense. So what we need to do is try and look at how we can attach different things together. So if you're trying to drink more water, you wake up in the morning, you put your feet on the ground and you drink a glass of water. That's a small routine. And the more that you do that, the more that you practice, and the practice making perfect, the more you see this myelin build up on the neurons representing that behavior, that routine, and that becomes the default. It becomes easy. We don't have time to debate with ourselves about what we will or won't do. But what's important about this is that we have to maintain that growth mindset as well. So as I said, just because we fail right now, it doesn't mean that all of it is gone, that it's useless. We shouldn't even continue. The fact is that we need to be a little bit more resilient. We need to recognize that flexibility is needed. So while we create lots of little routines, all of these tiny, tiny little building blocks, each just making a tiny difference to our brain chemistry. But that's what really builds up and makes the difference. So what I encourage you to do today is think about your routines and think about when routines don't work. Maybe figure out, oh, maybe that might work better a different way the next time. But all of these are supported by controlling the other factors. So recognize when a routine isn't working. I don't know how many times I tried different routines while I was doing my master's, get up early, stay up late. But the idea is that don't get too stuck. Don't get too stuck in your ways. Keep trying different things. Keep putting different things into your routine until you figure out a combination that works for you. And that might not work next week, but it's about keeping that growth mindset again. Now, we really couldn't talk about mental health and routines without touching on these two key pieces. Now, notice I haven't said workout, I've said movement, because you do not have to consider going to the gym and doing 1,000 push-ups in terms of maintaining your mental health. If you said to yourself, you know what, I'm going to walk to the shop today instead of driving to get my wine for this evening. Those tiny, tiny things, that's what really, really makes a difference. So in the moment, you get your happy hormones, you get your rush of endorphins, and that's the mood lifter right there and then. Now, on the long term, what exercise really helps us to do is get our regulatory processes back up and running. So important for sleep in terms of getting back to a thing called homeostasis, which is literally just balance, getting back down, winding down, and exercise is something that really, really helps with this. And this other word that I've written here, neurogenesis, this is one of the coolest things you can see in research when it comes to movement and exercise in general. So what the research tells us is that the more you exercise, the more you move around, the more you encourage this thing called neurogenesis. What neurogenesis is your brain actually physically making new neurons. And for years, they didn't even think this could be done. For years, they thought, yeah, your brain kind of finishes somewhere around like 25 or so. Not true. You can definitely teach an old dog new tricks. But what that means is that you've got new neurons supported by all of these other positive things that you've put together, both biologically and physiologically, so that they can grow. It's called neuroplasticity. It might be a word that you're familiar with. But recognizing that all of these components, all these tiny pieces can help with this, that's the really powerful thing that I want you to take from today. The research has so much around how neurogenesis is important for learning, for memory, or it's one of the most effective ways of dealing with depression. And there's a wealth of research to back that up. Now, the other side of our slide is looking at meditation. And I hope people aren't rolling their eyes at the idea of meditation. And I'll tell you a very quick story about, well, first off, the reason why I'm talking about meditation is the wealth of research behind it. And I tried to have this conversation with my dad a couple of weeks ago. And he kind of rolled his eyes and said, oh, meditation, that hippie stuff, sitting with your legs crossed and going, yeah, that's definitely a type of meditation. But his argument was, sure, wouldn't you be better off just going for a walk down the woods and enjoying the sun and breathing it in? And I said, yeah, Dad, that's also meditation. That's called mindfulness. So the thing about meditation, and this was one of the key pieces I actually looked at in my thesis, it's what it does is that it essentially gives your brain a chance to get back to this thing called default mode. And what that is your brain kind of firing about 10 times a second, and which is quite slow for your brain, for the record. But what it's like is like having the car turned on in the driveway, just tipping over. So it's not that your brain is turned off, it's just kind of gone back to a nice idling state. And that gives us a chance for idea generation and for your brain to repair itself. There's so many different things that meditation is good for. It's free. You can see effects so quickly, as little as 3 sessions. But the important thing is that you find a type that works for you. If it's prayer, if it's mindfulness like my dad, or if it's using apps to try and guide you through a thought process, it's about trying to give your brain just a little bit of a break to get back into that default mode. And I cannot stress enough how beautiful the research is around this simply wonderful exercise. So that's one thing that I'd really encourage you to just give it a go. Alrighty, so let's have a little chat about allyship. Firstly, with allyship for ourselves. I encourage you to find your people, find your confidants, people who you can really talk to. And people are a lot more open now, thanks to the pandemic, It's a lot more of people kind of acknowledging the fact that this is really hard. So, but in some cases, you're not going to find those people. And it's important to recognize that there are services out there as well, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. And when we think about those neural pathways, remember that they don't really know what they represent. It's just cells, it's just biology. When we think about negative thought cycles, our brain is really, really good at them, because once upon a time, they would have kept us alive. It's a survival mechanism to kind of assume the worst, because then you mightn't get eaten by the tiger. But now what that actually comes in as is like negative self-talk and just negative thought cycles around your perception of things. But if you let those neurons keep working out, they're going to keep being strong. So you have to try and just cut them off. It's something that really, really worked for me. And finally, be kind to yourself. This is not easy, and do not assume that I have the most perfect mental health in the world because I talk about this all the time. Definitely not. The pandemic has been so difficult for me and my family, and we don't even have reasons for it to be difficult. But it's about kind of saying, okay, it didn't go fantastically today. I'll try again tomorrow. There is absolutely no point in self-ridicule. It doesn't serve you and it doesn't serve anybody else. When we talk about others then, so we're assuming now our cup is nice and full. We feel capable of maybe helping others with their own mental health. It's a real Irish thing when you say, oh, how are you? Oh, I'm grand. But how are you? And when you ask that second time, that's when people kind of say, oh, well, you know, it's a bit of a rough day. And we're seeing a lot more of that now with the pandemic, but that's something I really want you to think about, that can you create that space? Could you share a little bit about your own experience and create that space for somebody who mightn't be as likely to do it or mightn't be in a position to do it as well as you did? Can you give them that space to do it themselves? And then finally, actively listen. So you might be thinking, oh God, I don't want to ask people how they are. What if they tell me something and I don't know what to say? I can assure you, as someone who has tried to maintain my mental health since I even realized it was a thing, people don't want solutions. People do not want you to say, well, I'm as a clinical psychologist, I can tell you X, Y, and Z would be a great idea since you're feeling down. That's not the case at all. People just want a listening ear. You don't have to have the answers. And to be honest, when you're in that kind of state, you don't want answers. You just want somebody to acknowledge and say, I hear you. Validation releases shame. If we can all do that together, that's when we're really going to see the dial shift and the destigmatization of mental health in society as a whole and our organizations specifically. So let's talk about our organizations then. Let's try and get the conversation started. So find things that resonate with you. Look at what you're engaging with yourself in terms of your news feeds. That's where you get the type of information that's coming in and choosing the neurons you're going to work out. Are you going to let the ones that perpetuate lots of negativity? Or are you going to look at things that give you more positive self-care messages? Meditation, as I said, wealth of resources. Insight Timer is a fantastic free app that I strongly recommend. There's also loads on YouTube and Spotify. Podcasts, Unlocking Us by Brené Brown is one of my absolute favorites, and I really encourage you to have a listen. Again, such a wealth of TED Talks as well. Sleep is Your Superpower is one of the coolest ones I've ever watched. Now, when we're thinking about the organization, so considering the other ones are more kind of personal pieces, when you're in your organization, there are little things that you can do, again, that are completely free. Send out comms around encouraging calendar health, saying this is the end of my day, really get that work-life balance built in. You can platform charities and resources. So for example, Aware have a fantastic lecture series. Once you raise that awareness internally, you can really encourage discussions around mental health and resources. People are experts in their own experience and they are happy to share when they're given the platform in most circumstances, from my experience at least. So encourage that community engagement. Fantastic, another free tool, Mentimeter. We're going to have a look at it now in a second, but it's free, it's anonymous, and seeing how others are doing is often very, very validating for people. If you can get leaders involved, again, hugely, hugely powerful. And employees' own experiences on mental health. You don't need mental health professionals for somebody to sit there and tell their story. Now, of course, you do want to get into the meaty stuff at some point. So if you are a HR professional, or if you're just an employee who wants to be a mental health champion, get that business case together. Start off with your free surveys and get the data. How do people feel about mental health in the organization? Get your free resources. So get all that engagement from everything else that we've talked about on this slide. And then you've got your proof of concept. Get a leader, get them backing you, and get it to top people. Because that's when you're going to have an opportunity to present your whole business case with all those holistic pieces you've looked at. And that's when you get funding, and that's when you can really build a strategy around taking it to the next level. Now, I do want to pause for a moment. As I mentioned at the beginning, I am not a counsellor or a clinical psychologist. All of this, I'm not even giving you advice. What I am giving you here is just suggestions, my own experience, what the research says. It is so important to recognize when you need additional help when it comes to mental health. So it's a sign of strength and not weakness. And that is something we need to change in society. And we can all do that here today together. So if it is a case that you're not in the best place, go and speak to your GP. They're going to be aware of local resources and where to direct you. The Samaritans, again, another wonderful resource that you can call on 116 123. And finally, if you are in immediate, or if you have an immediate concern about someone else, you can call emergency services. Or if it's yourself, you can call them yourself or go to the emergency room. So just to be aware that mental health, it is something serious and we must respect it, but it's important to know where the resources are. So to sum up today, little things make a big difference to your brain, but do your best. It's all you can do. Sometimes your best might be Netflix at 2 a.m. and a takeaway, and that's more than fine. Recognize that you need to recharge, and it's never time wasted to try and do a little bit. Remember, it's not a destination, and it's not that you failed. You just need to try again. It's trying to maintain some good habits most of the time. Consistency, it's easier with routine. Your brain doesn't spend energy deciding what to do or what not to do. So don't try to do a million things at once either. Just do little changes, try and get it to stick, and then do it at a pace that works for you and your circumstances. This wonderful pandemic and the winter that we face into, it really means that resiliency is needed when the routine isn't the same every day. So you need to forgive yourself when it doesn't go as planned and see where a change can be made that you can more likely to get it to work the next time. And finally, allyship is essential. Ask and ask again. Be your own ally, and then you create the space for others, and it becomes a paying it forward situation where they can then do it for the next person. So thank you all so much for today. As I mentioned, we're going to have a quick look at Mentimeter. So if you could just take up your mobile phone and turn on the camera and put it to this QR code. And what it's going to do, it's going to bring you to a website where you're going to be able to put in questions that are going to come through directly to me. Completely anonymous, so please feel free to ask whatever you wish. I also appreciate that we're almost at time here, so I'm more than happy to follow up after today with some notes just about what we talked about, but also to answer any of those questions that come in. And there's also a second slide just to give a little bit of feedback, so if you wouldn't mind popping a few words in there, I'd really appreciate it. And if you'd like to connect with me at a later date, please just find me on LinkedIn. Thankfully, both Susan and Katie tagged me lots of times in all of the posts that have gone up by Harvey Nash. So thank you to both Katie and Susan for giving me this opportunity. And now I'm going to pop over to Mentimeter and see if we have any questions coming in. So nothing just yet. We might give the questions a few minutes to come in, and I'll invite Susan to come back and do a little bit of a wrap up.
That was fantastic. Really good. We do have some questions just on the Zoom call if you want to.
Right.
Yeah. We have a question here. Hey, Áine, amazing presentation. As HR, we can face fears about not being qualified to address mental health with our employees. How can we reduce those fears?
So the main thing that I would say to that, Susan, is that it's exactly as I've talked about here. Nobody expects you to be an expert. If you can be the one who's just a listening ear, that you can validate someone and say, hey, you've taken the first step, you've talked to me about it. Now, let's maybe look at talking to your GP, here's some resources around, maybe should we try and talk to your next of kin. No one is expecting you to be any sort of an expert. It's just about being human in the moment, in my opinion.
Yeah, so really I suppose guiding towards the right resources is the best kind of, and as you said, the active listening is hugely important. Another question that came in, so how long, the thing like the blue light, which is a huge topic for people, how long before bedtime, simple question, should you really be throwing the phone down and not going near social media and everything else that the phone is used for?
The official recommendations are about an hour, to be completely honest with you. Now, that said, I pick up my phone to put my alarm on, or, it might be like a quick check-in and that. As long as you're kind of not glued to it right up until you try and kind of go, okay, sleep time. You just kind of give your brain a little bit of a chance. So I try and do at least 15, 20 minutes. But again, it's about finding what works for you as well.
Yeah. And one thing that kind of resonated with me as well is that whole routine thing, because that's something I certainly struggle with because of, my routine going to work, and that walk to work I had every day was what I really, really enjoyed. You mentioned a number of different things through your presentation. If there was kind of one thing that you would say to somebody that you could change by the weekend from everything you've mentioned, what do you think would be the standout thing for somebody to look at?
I would say exercise. I know I talked a lot about meditation, but I think that's something that people need to sometimes kind of get their head around. But when it comes to physical exercise, I hate being the one saying it because I'm awful for going to the gym, but just even getting in that 10-minute walk, like throughout all of lockdown, me and my partner got rolly chairs, and we're like Hitchcock and Sully from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, scooting around. I'm lucky if I break 1,000 steps during the day. So that would be my number one thing too. It's the same as even what the government were saying, just try and get out and do a little bit of walking. It's the most effective, in my opinion.
Okay, great. I'm just conscious of time as well for everybody. As Áine said, there is a way to get your questions through to her if you didn't want to throw them out there today. If there's any more questions, I'll give you one more second to pop them in there. Otherwise, thanks, Áine, great presentation and lots of lovely feedback. So thank you so much, Áine. That's been absolutely wonderful. It's as expected, really interesting for all of us. Just for everybody who's been on the call, just a reminder, we have all of our Nash Talks available on YouTube as well as this one, so you will be able to share with your colleagues and friends the wonderful content that Áine provided today. And again, thank you, Áine. It was delightful.
Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity, Susan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.